as we start to look forward into this upcoming NBA season, of course, every team in the league has some kind of question around their roster, the direction of their team, what their team's going to look like this year. What questions are they trying to answer this season? Let's talk about it for every single team in the NBA. First and foremost, the San Antonio Spurs, this entire season revolves around Victor Wembanyama, not only keeping him healthy, not only developing him, but really figuring out what his role is going to be on this team. What are they going to prioritize in terms of development? Because he can do so many different things. He can be a perimeter player. He can be a fantastic defensive guy. Do they want to work on his off-ball spacing a little bit? Do they want to make sure that he can create on the ball? What exactly did they want to pinpoint? Did they want to try and develop in his game? Because that's going to decide who they then surround him with over the next couple of seasons. Their entire season revolves around Wemby and potentially maybe how good they could be in his rookie season, depending on how many games he plays. Next up for the Detroit Pistons, I have written down, do they have the guys? And by that, I mean, how many foundational players do they truly have on the roster? I think Cade's going to be very good. He's coming off the injury last year. If he's healthy, if he's ready to go, he to me is still one of the best young guards in the Eastern Conference, and I can't wait to see if that comes true. Jaden Ivey, I have some question marks about. Obviously, still an extremely young player. Jalen Duren is there, and I still think he's going to be really good as well. Showed some good signs. There's still a lot of question marks, though, overall with the roster in Detroit of how many guys do they actually have that they really truly feel confident about. Of course, they just drafted the Thompson twin. Who are the guys? I think Cade is one. Do they have any others? They need to use this season to figure that out. Next up, the Houston Rockets. How much of a difference is Ime Udoka going to make for this team? Because if you listen to Rockets fans, they talk all the time about the poor coaching over the last couple of seasons, not utilizing their young players in the best possible way. And that's 100% true. And now there really aren't any more excuses for this Rockets team. Yes, they have young players, Jalen Green, Şengün. All these guys are still very, very young, but they invested in the roster with Dillon Brooks and Fred VanVleet. They invested in the coaching staff by bringing in Ime Udoka. And if they're still a 20-25 win team, even in a loaded Western Conference, then we're going to start to have some serious questions about what the future of the team is, how good these foundational players truly are with Amen Thompson, with Jabari Smith, with Jalen Green. We're really going to start to ask questions about this team if they can't figure that out. So this season is, how much of a difference do all those new additions make? And probably more importantly, do those new additions fit well in the long-term, mindset of what this team is supposed to look like? Next up, the Charlotte Hornets. The question for them is, how far can LaMelo take them? What is the true ceiling of this team with LaMelo as the best guy? What is LaMelo's ceiling individually as a player? Because if he is just going to be like a borderline all-star caliber guy, not an all-NBA guy, not one of the best guards in the league, then you have to start really doing some thinking about what the rest of the roster looks like, and is that the guy you really truly want to build around? But if he looks like someone that has all-NBA potential over the next couple of seasons, then you have your foundational player. It makes it much easier to build the rest of the roster at that point. Next up for the Portland Trailblazers, of course, I'm going to put down the Dame trade. Like, what are we going to do with him? Who are they going to get back in exchange? Are they going to wait until the deadline? As of the recording of this video, we really haven't had much movement at all in terms of him possibly being moved. That's by far their biggest question mark. And then, of course, what's going to happen with the young guys? How good is Scoot going to look as a rookie? What's the progression going to look like for Shaedon Sharpe? Are they going to move some other pieces on the roster? Guys like Yusuf Nurkic? Of course, those are the biggest question marks for Portland. Next up now is the Orlando Magic, one of my favorite young teams in the entire league. And the question for them is, do they have all the pieces that they need? Do they need to add anybody else? Do they need another young guard? Do they need to add an all-star caliber guard? Or is the combination of Franz Wagner, Paolo Banchero, the draft picks they brought in this year, Jalen Suggs, Markelle Fultz, continuing to develop, can they just sit and wait? Let these guys develop and be potentially one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference over the next couple of seasons? Or do they need to add a more veteran piece, a all-star level piece in the backcourt specifically? Because they have a ton of really interesting guys, but do they all fit together, and do they need to add one or two more players to that group? Next up are the Utah Jazz, and they, like a couple of other teams around the league, have an interesting decision to make this year, and that is, do they take a step back or take a step forward? Because they have the option to do both. They were pretty good at the beginning of last year before falling apart later in the season, probably on purpose to try and get a better draft pick, but they've got a ton of young talent and enough talent that they could certainly push for a play-in or maybe even a top 6 seed in the Western Conference, and they can choose to do that. They can choose to trade some of their assets and try and make that push happen, or they could continue to take some steps back if they wanted to, trade some of their veteran players, and that decision is entirely up to them and is something that they need to probably pick one or the other this season. Next up for the Wizards, they need to decide who are the keepers, who are the guys that they want to keep around to try and get some value out of moving forward, whether it be on the court or as trade assets. Of course, they brought in Jordan Poole, they brought back Kyle Kuzma, they brought in some other players via trade. Is Jordan Poole someone you want to keep on the roster long term? When, 3 years from now, when you're trying to be good again post rebuild, is Jordan Poole still going to be there? Is Kyle Kuzma still going to be there? Who are the keepers for this roster? Next up, the Dallas Mavericks, there's only one question that matters in Dallas, and that is, how can they keep Luka happy? Is that keeping Kyrie around? Is that trading Kyrie? Kyrie? Is that continuing to try and push for the postseason? Is that trying to go out and get another star alongside him and Kyrie? Is that pushing all the assets to the center of the table? Is that changing the coach? Is that changing the front office? Whatever needs to happen to keep an MVP caliber player like Luka around on the team, that's something that they need to be invested in and interested in doing. It's all, to me, about keeping Luka happy in Dallas. Next up for the Indiana Pacers this season is about finding their foundation. They have Tyrese Halliburton. They've got a couple of other interesting young players on the roster with Mathurin, guys they've drafted this year. Of course, Miles Turner's still there. Who are the foundational guys? Who are the players that you point to and you say, these three guys are the ones that we are building everything around? Of course, Halliburton is one. Who are the other players? It's similar to Detroit. Do they have one foundational guy? Do they have two? Do they have three? They need to figure that out this year. Next up is Oklahoma City. And to me, the question is, do they make the push towards the postseason this year? Is this the year that they cash in on some assets? They trade maybe one or two of their young players so that they can get in the postseason? Or do they maybe not even need to do that? Are they going to be good enough, talented enough that with some progression from some of their younger guys that they're going to be able to push for a top 6 seed in the West even without making some of those moves? This is by far, to me, one of the most interesting teams in the entire league this season. Moving on now to Chicago. I've made a video about this recently. The question for them, is it time to reset and rebuild? And to them, that could mean trading DeMar DeRozan. It could mean trading Nikola Vucevic. It could even mean trading Zach LaVine or all three of these guys this upcoming season. They are definitely in an era of transition where they're trying to figure out exactly what the future of their team looks like without Lonzo Ball being healthy again this year, and some pieces on their roster that are going to be very interesting to other teams, but also probably not that useful to Chicago over the next couple of seasons if they do decide to rebuild. Lots and lots of question marks about the Bulls roster this year. Moving on to the New Orleans Pelicans, this is the last year for them. The Zion and Brandon Ingram experiment, just how this entire roster is constructed, this to me is the last year that they can really go into the season and think, we're going to try this one out. If they have another year where they look good when they're healthy, but Zion gets hurt, Ingram has issues staying healthy, both of those two guys together never really look all that comfortable, they have to make a choice after this season, in my opinion. And it's going to go one of two ways. They're going to be healthy and look awesome and win 55 games, or they're not going to be healthy, they're not going to look awesome, and they're going to win 40 games. And depending on what happens in each of those scenarios, they're going to be able to make some choices on moving forward with this group or making some really significant changes. Next up now, the Toronto Raptors. Is Scottie Barnes the guy? Scottie Barnes, an all-NBA caliber player moving forward into the future that you can point to and say, not only is he a foundational player, but he is someone that it made sense for us to not include in the Kevin Durant trade. And he is someone that it made sense for us to continue to shift some things around in this roster to continue to prioritize him and his development. If he looks like he did last year once again, and after a fantastic rookie season has 2 seasons in which he just kind of stagnates, his position in the hierarchy of Toronto Raptors basketball moving forward for this team is going to change dramatically. And if things go really well for him, then he can be that guy and they can continue to really develop their entire team around what Scottie Barnes is going to look like. Next up, the Minnesota Timberwolves. Is it time to trade Karl Anthony Towns? I've talked about this in recent videos, but there's a decision to be made here that is really interesting, because with as good as Anthony Edwards is going to be, and with as much value as Rudy Gobert does still provide you on the defensive end of the floor, is Cat suddenly going to be the guy that's on the outside looking in of this roster that could be looking at a different team? And maybe you could get a lot of value, get a lot of the value back that you traded for Rudy Gobert and really spread out the talent on this roster. And then you've got Anthony Edwards, you got McDaniels, you got Gobert, you got the trade assets you get in exchange for Cat. Is that going to be good enough to maybe make you a top 4 team in the West? That to me is the question, and not to mention just obviously the fit between Cat and Gobert this season. Next up, the Atlanta Hawks. The question for them is, what is our ceiling? Where are we going with this? Are we just a 45-win team if everything goes right? Or do we have the possibility to be one of the better teams in the East, a 50-plus win team, if we're fully healthy, if we figure out some of our issues defensively? One more year of the Trae Young, DeJounte Murray combination. Do they make a trade for someone like Pascal Siakam to continue to add star power? If their ceiling is just a 45-win team, then there's going to be some big question marks there in Atlanta in terms of what the future of their team looks like. Next up, the LA Lakers. As always, the question for them is, are there going to be mid-season trades going down where they add star power to their roster? But more so this year than ever, because the way they've constructed their contracts of guys like Rui Hachimura, guys like D'Angelo Russell, they're extremely tradable deals and deals that add up conveniently well to salaries of guys like Kyrie Irving, James Harden. That mid-season trade possibility is always going to be there for the Lakers, and that's once again there for them this season. Next up, the Miami Heat. I'm going to keep it simple here. It's the Damian Lillard trade stuff and how they try and reintegrate all these players back into the roster if they don't make the Dame trade? How do they get Tyler Hero, Duncan Robinson, Nikola Jovic? How do they get these guys to focus on being productive members of the team when they've been trying to trade them for the entire summer? Moving on now to the Warriors, the question for them is, does the Chris Paul thing work? Does this ultimately just become a salary dump where they were just trying to get rid of the Jordan Poole contract and then Chris Paul shows up and plays 10 to 12 minutes a game for them? Or is he a really impactful player that potentially helps them push for another title alongside Steph? That is a very intriguing and an interesting question to me this season for Golden State. Next up now is the Brooklyn Nets. The question for them is, do they use the Kevin Durant assets or not? They have a lot of stuff laying around that they could go and try and make a Dame trade. They could go and try and do something with this stuff alongside Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Nick Claxton, an interesting core there, in addition to whatever Ben Simmons may or may not be this season. Is there a scenario where they start to look at their team and think, we could win 50, 55 games? We could maybe make the Eastern Conference Finals if things go right if we use some of these assets and add to our team? That's always going to be the question for Brooklyn. Keeping things simple again, next up is the LA Clippers. It's just the James Harden thing. Do they make the Harden trade? Does that trade actually make sense for them? Their entire season, really up until the season starts and then all the way to the deadline, is going to revolve around that, and of course the health of Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. Next up is the New York Knicks. The question for them is, can they figure out a way to be conference finals contenders? They have assets that they can make, some big moves on this team, or are they just going to be good enough with another year of Jalen Brunson, Julius Randle having a better season, RJ Barrett continuing to develop, and some uncertainty at the top of the conference? Maybe they're conference finals contenders. Next up, the Phoenix Suns. The question, of course, is the all-in, no point guard experiment going to work? They've added all these pieces this offseason. They've gotten rid of all their assets. They are all in on this era. They don't have a point guard. How exactly is all of that going to work? Cleveland is next. For me, the question is certainly the future of Donovan Mitchell on this team, as well as maybe the future of their front court as well. Really just the roster situation in general. Donovan Mitchell potentially being unhappy after this season, his impending free agency, the concerns that caused, as well as at what point do you move Evan Mobley to the 5, maybe get rid of Jared Allen, really start to shake up this roster after what was a really disappointing, look in the postseason last year against the Knicks. Next up is the Sacramento Kings. How can they prove that last year wasn't just a fluke? They were one of the best teams in the West last year, extremely competitive in the postseason. Nobody can deny that. How do they make sure that they continue that momentum and that it wasn't just some kind of fluke season for them last year? The Sixers are next, keeping things simple with them. Again, it's the James Harden thing. It's the Joel Embiid thing. How can they try and salvage that situation? Next up is the Memphis Grizzlies. Of course, the Ja suspension is the biggest thing hanging over this team, but also the ceiling of their team. They've had some struggles in the postseason, obviously due to injuries in a couple of different postseasons. But is the Ja, Jaren Jackson, no more Dylan Brooks, Marcus Smart added into the equation? Does all of that work as a true top team in the West, or are they just a good regular season team that's going to continue to struggle in the postseason? The Celtics are next. Of course, for them, it's always going to be about what's the future of Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum together, in addition to Joe Mazzulla as the head coach. That was a big issue for them last year. Does that get fixed this year? And as a result, can they push for a title this season? Second to last, we have the Denver Nuggets. Their questions are, do the offseason departures matter? Like, is this something that is going to really impact their team, not having Bruce Brown on the team, not having Jeff Green on the team? Or is the combo of Murray, Jokic, MPJ, that combination of guys just good enough that it doesn't matter if some of your key role players leave each offseason? I would expect them to still be championship contenders, very, very good championship contenders this season. And the last up is Milwaukee. And of course, whatever's happening with Giannis, in addition to the aging core of their team, that's always going to be at the top of the list in terms of questions and concerns for Milwaukee. And those are the biggest questions for every single NBA team entering this upcoming season.